Welcome to this podcast of Real Estate Prosperity. My name is Robert Metz. I'm the author of the just published book entitled Real Estate Prosperity. My book is available in both e-form and hard copy at www.realestateprosperityllc.com. This is the second in a series of podcasts which address the outlines of methods of financing or controlling your purchase of foreclosure or other properties. Again, unless you can pull the trigger on the good deal that you find, it is all meaningless. And a lot of times you do not necessarily have the sufficient cash or wherewithal to just do it in the conventional manner. In our first podcast, we discussed the installment contract and the sale-leaseback methods of what we call seller or seller-assisted financing. And again, these methods can apply to a property in foreclosure that you're buying or your ordinary generic garden variety purchase. A third method of financing your purchase is by virtue of the assumption of an assumable mortgage. All Veterans Administration, VA, and Federal Housing Administration, FHA, sometimes referred to as HUD mortgages, both being federally backed or insured mortgages, are by law assumable. It's a very simple, very economical process to assume these mortgages, and your credit is not an issue. In assuming a mortgage, sometimes the consent of the lender is required, sometimes it's not. Again, in VA and FHA mortgages, it's a perfunctory transaction, some paperwork, and a modest fee, and the consent is basically guaranteed. It's part of the program. In other mortgages which can be assumable, and again, for conventional home mortgages, most recent mortgages are not assumable, at least recent bank or institutional mortgages. I'm not talking about seller take-back financing as being an assumable mortgage at this point. Where seller consent is required, the mortgage may indicate that the consent has to be given under certain conditions, or may contain language to the effect that the consent will not be withheld unreasonably. Again, a lot of times the language can be subject to interpretation. If the seller has to consent, or the lender rather has to consent to the assumption of the financing, what is reasonable and unreasonable? Every case differs, but there are certain parameters in the various jurisdictions. So if you're assuming financing, trying to assume financing, and it's not VA or FHA, or on its face it is not assumable per se, no consent required, you hope that the documents, the mortgage and the note, contain generic language that use words like reasonable, reasonably. Okay? But the assumption of existing financing can be a very valuable method. Today, you might be purchasing a property, just to make the numbers simple, for $100,000. And again, depending on when that property was purchased, it may have a very high principal mortgage amount or not. But if you have a high principal mortgage amount, again, on a government VA FHA mortgage, for example, where a lot of the mortgages are 100%, 96% of the purchase price, if the mortgage is assumable, as the VA and FHAs are, and you do not have good credit, or you have poor credit, you can walk into the property, assuming the other numbers are right, and all the other criteria of the purchase, in terms of affordability, fair market value, etc., makes sense to you, and with very little money out of pocket, and with poor or no credit, you can buy the property. Of course, as I indicate in my book, there are certain issues. There's certain issues with everything. The seller remains liable on the mortgage if you default. That's a drawback, but again, depending on the market in the given area, sometimes that is not a drawback to the seller. The seller is glad to get some money out of the property. To sell it may be difficult to move property, to sell a property in maybe a very difficult market, and go on with his life and take a certain risk. There's also what we can call the assumption of a non-assumable mortgage. If it's a garden variety conventional mortgage that is not assumable, or if the mortgage indeed states that is not assumable, even without any conditions set, it can still be assumed. There can be negotiations. You can try to work something out with the existing lender. He might want to change in the interest rate, a change in points, change the terms, change the length of the mortgage. Or another way of trying to assume a non-assumable mortgage, indeed without the consent of the lender, even where the lender would oppose it, or where you feel it's not even worth approaching the lender, that it's a foregone conclusion that the lender will not cooperate, is by adding your name to the deed, keeping the seller, keeping your seller on the deed, in title as they say, and on the mortgage. Again, this would be subject to an agreement being worked out and recorded between buyer and seller, again, which I go into in depth in my book, by which there are certain guarantees going either way in terms of the quote-unquote joint ownership going forward, in terms of distributing rights and liabilities, remedies upon default, management issues, control issues. But the bottom line is, depending on your financial abilities, your credit, you can get into a property where it is a non-assumable mortgage by either negotiating an assumption with the lender, or more frequently, adding your name to the deed and having a superseding agreement between your seller and yourself, such that he is still on the deed, such that he is still on the mortgage, and you have not taken the mortgage from him. He has not tried to assign the mortgage to somebody else. Therefore, the mortgage is still in his name, and the non-assumption clause does not prevent your proceeding, and it does not trigger what you would call a due on sale clause, meaning that the lender declares the seller in default for having assigned a mortgage or let somebody assume it when it's not assumable, and the lender starts a foreclosure and says, hey, I want my mortgage paid off. You violated the terms. This is not an assumable mortgage. You, my original borrower, have to remain on the mortgage. In this scenario, the buyer is remaining on the mortgage. The deal is structured between you, the lender rather, is remaining on the mortgage. The deal is structured between you, the buyer, and the seller, and the lender cannot complain. It's not an assumption. It's adding the buyer's name to the deed to take advantage of existing financing that is not assumable. You can also buy subject to an existing non-assumable mortgage, but there is a risk in this method, by doing a complete closing, having the seller convey title to you. The seller will no longer be on the deed, you will be on the deed, and you are taking subject to the existing non-assumable mortgage. You are not getting the consent of the lender, you are not assuming it. You just step into the seller's shoes, continue to pay the mortgage. Again, there are issues here which you would have to consult your attorney on, and the jurisdictions do vary. There are obviously risks, because if the lender gets wind of it, the lender may choose to accelerate the mortgage, put it into foreclosure. Typically, especially on institutional securitized mortgages from the large national or international lenders and security trusts, where a lot of these mortgages are bundled and deposited in for longer term holding by the lenders, they do not get wind of it and they do not care. But that's not a guarantee, although it is worth noting that taking subject to an existing non-assumable mortgage with all of its risks can at times be a viable method with proper legal counsel, structuring it as best possible in your jurisdiction, but it can be a viable method to gaining control of the property, to buying the property, where otherwise you could not do it because you do not have the ability or the resources to finance it. And again, if the lender were to foreclose, you could always then go to sell the property. But again, structure this method with proper counsel locally, but it is a viable method to buy subject to the existing financing. Another method of seller financing or seller-assisted financing is a seller take-back of the first or second mortgage. As I indicate in my book and discuss at length, this method is very often used in a tough mortgage market where interest rates, qualifying terms are high, where mortgage money is tight. and the banks are not originating many new mortgages. The seller can take back a new first or a new second mortgage, depending again on the equity in the property, the amount of money that you have down as a buyer, the amount that you need to finance, what the property is worth, the seller's abilities, how much money he may or may not need out of the property at closing. The seller can finance you in terms of a new first mortgage or a new second mortgage. And this scenario can cover cases where the seller is paying off his own first mortgage, where maybe the seller has no first mortgage. So the seller can give you the first mortgage, whether he's paying off a first or he has no first himself. Or you can get a new first mortgage, and the seller at or after closing can give you a second mortgage to bridge the difference between what you need to purchase a property and what you can borrow yourself on the open market. So seller take-back mortgages, as they're called, whether it's a first mortgage for the entire price, for the entire purchase price, or whether it's a second mortgage as a supplement to a new mortgage that you, the buyer, get, or as a supplement to a mortgage that, in fact, you may be able to assume. You can have a mortgage assumption, and at the same time, the seller can take back a second mortgage in addition to the mortgage that he had that you assume. And again, these all go to equity issues. What's the property worth? What are your abilities to finance? What is your credibility with the seller? What are the seller's needs? But they're all viable methods. There are many ways to structure a deal when the proper resources are not there for the buyer. Some of these methods are creative, some of them are nothing new at all, but properly structured with a foundation of knowledge on the part of the buyer, proper legal counsel at closing, a properly negotiated contract, and a little bit of luck in terms of the numbers and the positions of buyer and seller prior to closing. These are methods that can help make a deal and sometimes help make a very valuable deal where there's good potential, whereas otherwise, in the traditional means, the deal simply could not be made. And again, these deals can be used in a foreclosure situation, in a perfectly good credit non-foreclosure situation. They can be made where you're looking to get into a property to rent it out, to renovate it, to demolish it and build something else, to live in it, to use it as a retail location, to play the market. You name it, you can control properties through seller-assisted and direct seller financing when other means are simply not available or are not realistic for the particular situation. In addition to these 6 methods, there are approximately 10 or so methods that fall under the umbrella of more generic, conventional methods of financing. Again, when there's conventional financing, the more standard financing, there will typically be a contingency in the contract as to the financing that is sought and that will be obtained. And again, if there's a contingency, as I will discuss further in my next podcast, depending on the language of the contingency, that can make it into a very valuable contract for either buyer, seller, or both.